One of the most damaging forms of media is when the media will make a headline, front page news, which is a lie, and then 2 days later, they will retract it on page number 8. Once the cat is out of the bag, getting it back in is not easy at all. It rarely, if ever, happens. The UN has been doing the exact same thing. And this has been done blatantly with incidents that happen in Gaza, and also regarding the count of deaths in Gaza, which only now, after months, over a year of claims, is being slowly retracted. Here is a major who went into Gaza to investigate this matter, sharing his results about what the actual death toll is in Gaza. Let's watch this very important video.
Andrew Fox, a former British officer and a disinformation expert, 3 tours of Afghanistan. You yourself have been to Gaza. Do you think that the death toll is large enough for this to be classified in any way, shape or form as a genocide?
I'm not seeing any tactics they use that certainly we in the British Army or the American Army wouldn't use. In terms of the mismatch between the two forces, there's nothing in international humanitarian law that says war has to be a fair fight. We found clear proof of people who died of natural causes being on those lists, so there could be as many as 6,000 people on those fatality lists attributed to the IDF who simply died of natural causes. The number of overall people in Gaza has risen since the start of the war. 60,000 mark of babies born in Gaza since the start of the war, which is more than even the number of people that Hamas claim have been killed. So particularly when it comes to genocide, actually if the number of people in Gaza has increased, that very much is not destroying in whole or in part any kind of group in Gaza whatsoever.
Andrew, one of the things you've been working on for the last few months is the death toll in Gaza. It's one of the most hotly debated aspects of the Israel-Hamas war. You have done a very, very in-depth report on all of these reports around the death toll. What are the main findings of this report?
It's been an interesting few months digging into these figures. Well, we've been living daily with thousands of dead civilians. I think it's very important to start by acknowledging that fact, that a number of innocents have died in Gaza. That is one of the features of war, though, unfortunately. When wars occur, women and children and innocents are usually the greatest victim. What we found looking into the Hamas fatality statistics from Gaza, however, is that there is enough data manipulation in there to raise real concerns. So things we found, we can give you examples of people who are listed as being killed by IDF action, who've gone into Israel to receive cancer treatment. We've found people that died in 2014 and 2022. We've also found a real trend of reducing the ages of people on those lists to drag them down from being 18-year-olds to being 17-year-olds and therefore children. And so our key finding is that when you're presented with breakdowns of men, women and children killed, these are almost certainly unreliable.
So how many civilians would you say have died in this war so far?
It's still a very significant number. And if we take the rough 42,000 that Hamas have listed, 34,000 plus of those are named, and they claim they have bodies for them. Obviously, we have no way to verify that. The IDF claim 17 to 20,000 Hamas militants have been killed in those numbers. And we found a degree of data that actually does support that men, particularly in the 15 to 50 age group, are indeed dying in much greater numbers than women and children and people who are in the elderly or in the infant bracket. My estimate of civilians killed at the moment is still sitting around potentially the 20,000 mark. Somewhere plus or minus 5,000.
Do you think that there is enough, that the death toll is large enough for this to be classified in any way, shape or form as a genocide? Perhaps the beginning of a genocide?
No, not at all. And there's a number of key reasons for that. First of all is the amount of munition dropped in Gaza. You know, there's almost, I think it's 2 tons for every civilian killed, which either suggests one of two things. Either it's the IDF attempting a genocide and being the least accurate shots in history, or it's that they are following a proper targeting process and hitting targets that are legitimate and proportionate military targets. And the main reason that the civilian death count is so low is that in the areas where the IDF are fighting, there are no civilians, or indeed very few civilians. And that's because the IDF has taken unprecedented measures to evacuate civilians from the area. And critics of Israel can't have it both ways. They can't publish the images of civilians evacuating from these areas and claim that is somehow part of a humanitarian disaster, and then at the same time claim that civilians are dying in genocide level figures. It's one or the other. Of course, humanitarian situation such as we have in Gaza is extremely challenging for those civilians, and we must consider those poor Gazans who are innocent and sat in al-Mawasi humanitarian camp with their homes destroyed and their personal possessions limited to what they can carry. But that doesn't make it a genocide.
There's a lot of talk about proportionality. If you look at social media, critics of Israel will very often say the response is not proportional. What is proportionality as defined in military law?
You can't look at the conflict in its entirety and look at the effects of the conflict to make any assessment of proportionality whatsoever. The important thing to note about proportionality is that it has to be assessed on a strike-by-strike, action-by-action basis. And the simple question is this: is the target struck worth the number of civilian or other collateral damage inflicted by that airstrike? So, for example, had they used an airstrike on Sinwar, they could have justified a large amount of munitions. And that's what they were able to do with Mohammed Daif, who was Sinwar's number 2. He was killed in a huge airstrike with a number of 2,000-pound bombs and a bunker-busting bomb used. And there was significant collateral damage in that airstrike. But it was Hamas's number 2. You could justify a huge amount of damage to take out a target of that exceptional military value. If that had been a lone Hamas gunman, you couldn't have justified that whatsoever. And so proportionality, you can't look at the entirety of the conflict. You have to look at each individual airstrike and say, was that justified against the amount of damage it caused?
In terms of the reports, what are the main sources that you analyzed when you did this report on the Gaza death toll? What are the sources aside from the Gaza Ministry of Health?
So there are 2 main sources of casualty figures from Gaza. There's the Gaza Ministry of Health and there's the government media office in Gaza. And we've tried to focus on their documentation because actually there's a load of reports and there's loads of people who've looked at these figures and they've produced statistical analyses. Some have said that they think the death toll will be up to 186,000. Some have said it's far lower than that. Actually, that's no real use because they're secondary source. So we've always tried to stick to the primary source where we can. The other main source we've used is the social media of Hamas and Gazans themselves. And through that, we found people who are openly accepted to have been beaten to death by Hamas during the conflict. They're included on the list as having been killed by the RDF. And we found some really interesting stuff pushed out by Hamas on Facebook in earlier wars, where they are exhorting civilians in Gaza not to mention militant deaths, not to mention if one of their loved ones was Hamas, and to keep that as secret as possible. And so when people say in previous conflicts these Hamas lists have been reliable, that's not true either, because there was a clear pattern of Hamas suppressing fighter deaths throughout their recent conflicts with Israel.
One of the big scandals at the beginning of the war was the Al Ahli hospital, which immediately became a massive social media story, and not just, it actually became a major mainstream media story where the Hamas version of events was immediately taken at face value. I believe there was even a New York Times front page run with that. And it then turned out that it was actually an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired. How many of the deaths do you think are actually due to misfired rockets, friendly fire, and Hamas just basically self-regulating and policing the area under their control?
It's extremely tricky to say. Hamas make these lists incredibly difficult to interrogate. To start with, they don't declare any cause of death, and that makes verifying it incredibly challenging. They also mix up the lists. So rather than go from 1 to 50 for list 1 and then continue at 50 to 100 for list 2, they jumble the order of the names each time. They add in columns, take away columns, and it makes comparing the lists side by side extremely difficult. We can say with certainty that thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel since the war started, and we know a significant proportion of those drop short. Again, we don't have the exact figures of that in a way that we can verify, but these will have almost certainly caused civilian casualties. We also know that the natural death rate before the war was 514 people in Gaza a month died of natural causes. And that clearly will have
514
a month.
Of natural causes?
514 a month.
So of old age?
Of old age, of disease, of illness. And And that gives us a total of 6,000 potentially have died since the start of the war. And again, we found clear proof of people who died of natural causes being on those lists. So there could be as many as 6,000 people on those fatality lists attributed to the IDF who simply died of natural causes. It's also worth noting that probably the number of overall people in Gaza has risen since the start of the war. We've seen clear reports that there's a birth rate of over 5,000 a month, which puts us somewhere around the 60,000 mark of babies born in Gaza since the start of the war, which is more than even the number of people that Hamas claim have been killed. So particularly when it comes to genocide, actually, if the number of people in Gaza has increased, that very much is not destroying in whole or in part any kind of group in Gaza whatsoever.
The number of people in Gaza increased since October 7th. How many people do you think know this? It's good to have the facts, and we need to try and inform the world as much as we can, despite the repeated lies that were said over and over for over a year.